Well, I'm really excited to be here and be talking to all of you today. I spent a little time when I was preparing for this talk thinking about what I wanted to do today. So before I get into it and before I get going, here is my goal. Here's my intention. I want to show you enough of my work to give you an idea of what I make and also show you some of the mental scaffolding that underpins my work. I did decide, I mentioned earlier, I decided that 8 pots is a lot of pots. So I've already cut us down to 7 so that I don't keep us too long. And I'll try and move pretty quickly. But yeah, that's what we'll be doing today. So I am a potter and I've been making work for about 10 years now. And I really love working with such a tactile medium. I love how closely tied it is to craft. And for me, craft is a vehicle for telling stories. And the most important thing to the telling of a story and the hearing of a story is attention. Um, as social media and news and everything going on in our lives has taken great pains to teach us, attention is the most valuable thing that we have. It's very easy to squander it. It's very hard to put your attention where you actually want it to be. And we are under a near constant assault on our attentional reserves. It's so much is happening so much of the time that we really get burned out and we cease to be able to function as we would like to be functioning. I recently read a book called Attention Span, which I highly recommend. And it described how drastically shortened our attention spans have become, even in the last 10 to 15 years. And that makes it really hard for us to connect with each other, to have discussions about anything that involve any kind of nuance, or even to hold multiple ideas or multiple opinions about things in your head at the same time. And as artists, that is the context that we're all working in, that it's a real fight to get and hold on to someone's attention. So in my work, I am chasing a little bit of space. I want a little bit of time. I am trying to make room for contemplation. And in order to do that, I just need to stop the world for a minute. And I see minimalism as an excellent tool for doing that. I'm trying to create this space that I can cohabitate with the a viewer quietly. And I do that by trying to strip away as much as I possibly can from every piece that I make. And then I'm trying to bring in some note of simplicity or some detail that is interesting enough to examine, but it's complex enough to hold on to the meaning that I'm trying to impart. So the more I can take away, the easier that becomes. In practical terms, that means that I use a lot of, for minimalism for me, means using a lot of burnished bare clay, and I'll have a line or maybe 2 lines. Occasionally, there'll be a very subtle texture. I like to use the clay itself as the main source of color and take away as much as I can around that. I really like the spareness and the starkness of things that don't have a lot of decorative elements to them, because that allows me to say, this is what I want you to pay attention to. This is the focus. Here is where we are. And it allows me to get that space that I want. All of that is very much, I think, a reaction to the constant assault on our attention because the world is so loud and it's so fast that it's overwhelming. And like probably a lot of you, I see inherent value in slowing down, doing things with a little bit more deliberate intention and on purpose. And I want my work to both illustrate that and inspire that in people. So I want people who are encountering my work to be able to tap into something maybe they don't see every day, or in a way that can be both familiar and new. And that brings me to the first of our 8 pots, or 7 pots. And it's what I call my spark cup. So I take the concept of a spark cup from the bird watching community. Bird watchers have this really wonderful universal term that they call their spark bird, and it's the bird that got that person into becoming a bird watcher. I am not a birder, but I really love that idea that there is this thing that got you excited, or this thing that got you into whatever your passion is, and into developing their passion. And this is my spark cup. This is one of the first pots that I ever made. It is a pinch pot made of recycled cone 10 clay. So this was actually one of the early assignments that I took when I first started working with clay at Tacoma Community College, where I took classes with, it's where I met Rito Zaki and where I took classes with Rick Mahaffey 10 years ago. And there's a couple of things about this pot that I made that still resonate with me today. The first one is just the simplicity of it. It has some design elements that I still employ, the unglazed exterior and the lack of decoration. And that lack of decoration is a big part of who I am as an artist. I love being part of that tradition, of the minimalism tradition, and using that constraint as a way of expressing an idea. But more importantly, this is the cup that cemented my understanding that handmade pottery will change your life. All of you listening already know that eating and drinking out of handmade pottery is a fundamentally different experience than eating and drinking off of commercially made ware. But there was a time that we didn't know that. I did not know that before I made this cup, before this cup. I had some ordinary dishes that I got from Macy's or West Elm or somewhere, and they were fine. They worked great. But as I started making work and using it, and buying work from other potters and using it, I really began to see the difference. And that's what this spark cup represents for me. So, of course, I knew and understood that if you have super fancy china, it's going to elevate your dinner, or if you have heirloom dishes that have been passed down, those are going to hold family memories. But this cup demonstrated something very viscerally about the magic of the handmade. And I just want to talk about that for a little bit. So, when I was in elementary school, we were taught that there were five senses. Today, kids are taught that there are nine senses. And I know that there is no way that we have fully mapped out the entire realm of things that humans can perceive. So we don't have a name for what I am describing here, but the fact that I know that this object will carry something that I can perceive that is perceivable by humans, that is different from commercially made cup, that was revolutionary to me. And it really inspired me to think about how, even though it doesn't have a name and I can't fully explain it or even understand the mechanism behind it, I could use it. And thinking about how I can use that sense opened up huge possibilities for me in thinking about craft and in thinking about art. This cup also, the second thing this really did was inspire me to think about my work in a more distributed fashion. So rather than just as a bunch of things that I made. I went to grad school for library science, and there's a concept from cataloging that I'm going to share with all of you that I find really suits the way I think about this, just right down to the ground. This next slide has a lot of words, no pots, but it illustrates something that's really central to the way that I think about my practice. So there's this cataloging concept that describes thinking about creative entities like books into four classes. There's the work, the expression, the manifestation, and the item. And I can actually explain it really quickly. It took me a long time to catch this in grad school, but you can explain it really quickly with an example like Cinderella. So Cinderella is the work. It's the underlying story that is a rags to riches story, and there's a blended family, and there's people falling in love, and royalty and magic. And that's kind of Cinderella as this abstract work. Then there's the hundreds, if not thousands, of expressions of Cinderella. So there's Disney's Cinderella, there's a book called Stepsister, there's Cinder, there's books all over the world, there's stories all over the world that are expressions that all tie back to that original work of Cinderella. Each one of those expressions will have a manifestation, whether that's the full print run of the book or the master reel of the film. And then there are individual items, which are like a single hardcover book or a paperback or a DVD. And this framework of thinking really appeals to me because I want to occupy the space that is both the abstract underlying work and expression, and then the tangible manifestation and the concrete item, those tangible and intangible things at the same time. So I can have these abstract ideas and then ground them in the medium of clay and really emphasize both aspects of that. And there's just something about this framework that I find really compelling, this way of thinking about this as an artist. And that's kind of the final thing that this cup taught me. And that is the importance of revision in this framework. I really love that with the practice of a craft, refining that original idea is part of the work. It's just going to be a new expression, or potentially it's just a new item within a single manifestation. It's just something that is ongoing, but all connected and tied back up. And that inexact but related repetition I think really celebrates the built-in variation that we're always going to get with handmade work and with handmade ceramics. So even within the same manifestation, no two items are ever going to be exactly alike, and I really love that. I love that they're connected, but also unique. And obviously, the concept of working in a series or working in series like this is nothing new. Cezanne painted the same mountain over 80 times, but being part of that kind of a practice of repeating things and working in this framework feels very grounding to me as an artist. Next pot number two that I want to talk about is what I consider my entry into a larger artistic space. So this is a piece that I conceived 6 years ago when America was dragged into a national reckoning with race and facing having to kind of grapple with the vastly different experiences that people in this country have based on what color we are. And this was the summer of 2020. Prior to this, when I had been making work and being in events and shows, and I still participated and sold my work, but I didn't share any pictures of myself as an artist online. And I had a very logical reason for that. I have been around long enough to know that work made by Black people is both held to a higher standard and also simultaneously devalued. And I just didn't want to deal with that. I didn't want to have to defend my right to make the kind of work that I make. I didn't want to have to defend my pricing, but which understandably we all have to defend our pricing, but I didn't want to defend it because of my race. But that summer, the world really just would not be ignored. And the reality of being a Black artist in America knocked on my door of the studio and said, come into this conversation. You have to be a part of this. And so this piece was inspired by two conditions at the time. The first condition that really inspired this were the protests and the marches and the rallies and all of the public gatherings that were happening all over the world, particularly the protest signs and the signs people put in windows and in storefronts. And people were so willing to stand up and say something, and they were so creative in that was very inspiring to me. Just walking in my neighborhood or going into shops and seeing Black Lives Matter signs created a very tangible sense of safety and solidarity in me. Those signs meant and still continue to mean a lot to me personally. So I can connect that feeling that I have with that unnamed sense. I feel like I can perceive the sentiment behind those signs in my body, in my soul, and I wanted to represent and recreate something about that. The second piece of inspiration for these came from contemplating the people who didn't go to marches, who didn't protest, and who didn't put up signs. And I'm not talking about the people who were in vocal opposition to what was happening, but they just didn't engage with what was going on around them. Some people were, of course, caught up in their own lives and their own struggles. Some people maybe thought it didn't relate to them, or maybe they thought that they weren't invited in or it was not inclusive of them. Many people just had the luxury to choose whether or not to give what was going on any attention because it wasn't forced on them. And that really interested me because where the protests made room for the voice of the collective and this massive amount of public storytelling, these huge gatherings of people, I wanted to make room for personal storytelling. I wanted to design something that could quietly capture the attention of that unlikely audience. So my vision around this work was to give some of the people who were going to the marches a way to bring the protest from the big public square into the private sphere and to bring that home so that they could connect with those unlikely audience friends of theirs. Their friends who didn't really understand what all the fuss was about, who weren't really connected to this. And I wanted to give them a way to invite those people into this conversation we were having on a personal level. And we all know that when you are learning something that is new, that is outside of your experience, or something that contradicts a view that you've held, statistics and facts and chance are probably not very effective tools for learning that or for connecting. So I wanted these cups to act as a bridge between people who were engaged and protesting and marching and people who were never going to go to a protest and never going to go to a march, and create some space so that those two people who are friends could have a conversation over a cup of coffee or over a glass of wine and share how race had impacted their lives and their outcomes in a way that both of them could hear each other, could actually hear each other. So this piece marked the shift, I would say, in my artistic journey from making work to telling stories with my work. And this was its original expression. Design-wise, I made these cups very low and inviting, something that you could hold in your palm very comfortably. So it would give the people in that conversation something to do with their hands. They had an elevated pedestal foot that I wanted to bring in some of the determination and the pride of the people who were fighting for recognition and their place in the world. And the symbol on those, the three-line symbol, that is an abstraction of the Black Lives Matter word mark that was created by the Oakland Design Collective. And that design, that word mark is just a brilliant piece of design because it was made to be recognizable and recreatable at any different scale with very minimal tools and minimal skill. So you're stacking words on top of each other, and you could do that on a shirt or a cardboard sign or on the sidewalk. It's not hard to draw, and people know what it is. So I wanted to create that feeling of someone drawing this out with chalk on asphalt, the energy of somebody writing something on the street. So I'm using this very bright yellow on a deep black clay in order to do that. So this cup was the original, the initial expression. The second expression was a pendant, which is a wearable. The first one was a functional protest sign, and then it was a wearable protest sign. And then last summer, I made a third expression. And that was prompted by everything that's happening right now in our world, and particularly, very particularly, the violent removal of the Black Lives Matter plaza mural in Washington, D.C. That was a very painful thing for people like me who felt seen through the visibility of that plaza and who, I felt the original intent of putting the plaza down and that I perceived the safety around that and what that imparted. And I also felt and perceived what the message was in having it torn away so violently overnight. So I wanted to revisit this work and come back to this. So this new form, this new expression was inspired by a mid-century modern design for a water tumbler or a juice glass. It's a design that it's a truncated cone, and it was a design that was very popular during the 1960s era of the civil rights movement. And one goes up and one goes down, and I'm thinking of these in pairs. So for these, rather than that elevated pedestal base of the first expression, I'm really grounding these with a slightly inverted curved foot as a way of communicating that it's holding steady, and I want to give it more stability. And I'm calling this expression justice like water because it needs that sense of rootedness and security. So in addition to the abstracted Black Lives Matter word mark or on the lines on the side, on the bottom, they're stamped with the words, yes, still. And that is me just being very literal, saying, yes, our lives still matter. Yes, this fight is still going on. And I think that this third expression really starts to show why this framework, this work expression manifestation item, WIMI workshop work framework really appeals to me, and it exposes the diasporic nature of craft. So this helps me think about not only the three expressions I've made to date, the cup and the pendant and justice like water, but also of any future iterations of this piece. I'll be able to tie them all back very concretely to that Black Lives Matter conceptual protest sign work and place it in time. But I can bring this idea into the world however it needs to be brought into the world. I'm not going to be limited by having to make the exact same cups that I made the first time over and over and over. This framework kind of allows me to have the flexibility that I like and I want. There is a line that poets say about poetry, and that is that a poem can be anything it needs to be. So if a poem needs to rhyme, it will rhyme. If it needs to be performed, it will be performed. If it needs to be a single word, it will be a single word. Whatever it needs to be is allowed. And I like how this framework helps me think of my work in that same way. And I'm just talking on. If people have questions, or they can put them in the chat, and I'll hopefully have space and time to answer them at the end. But if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear those as we're going along, or and you can type them into the chat. I'm not watching it right now, but I will read them all. Okay. This next piece that I'm going to talk about is called Even a Woman or a Slave. And it's really illustrative of one central aspect of my practice, and that is working from source material. So, working from current events or making commentary on things that are happening is one thing that I do, but often there are things that I've read or parts of history that I've learned about that will catch my attention and prompt me to make a piece as a way of thinking about it. So a few years ago, I was listening to the audiobook version of Aristotle's Poetics, and I heard a fraction of a line that really just stopped me in my tracks. So the Poetics is a treatise about storytelling. It's very, very readable, very engaging. It's aimed at playwrights, and it dissects the craft of telling an effective story. The Poetics has been a seminal piece of work in classical education for centuries. It is very, very strongly the foundation of a lot of ideas that we have around what we judge as worthy or unworthy in the media that we consume. And there's a bit of a throwaway line in the chapter where he's talking about character development, where he calls on playwrights to create believable characters that think and feel and act in ways that will be plausible to an audience. He wants you to think about who the protagonist will be and what you can believably have them do. You can ask your audience to suspend their disbelief a little bit, but the stories need to have a veracity so that the audience can recognize as true in order to connect with it. Then he takes care to note this little quote right here. He notes that even a woman or a slave can be used to good effect. Essentially, he's saying, though we can't expect too much from those people, those types of people, or the audience won't buy it. And the word even in there is what stopped me in my tracks. The casualness of differentiating that I find just gutting, because it exposes not only who the Poetics is aimed at or who it's meant for, which is not people who look like me, but it also exposes the authors and all of greater society's inability to recognize the humanity of people who look like me. And I am not going after Aristotle here. The point of this is that this thought was so pervasive. Everyone thought this way, and many people still do think this way. The construct of pointing it out at all, of saying even a woman or a slave, of condescending to allow agency, but in such a limited capacity that it's always going to be subject to the approval or the judgment of the other, of someone who thinks themselves superior. That's what I'm kind of engaging with here. So the underlying hierarchy of this has really been baked into, oh, and my slides were out of place. We'll come back to this. The underlying hierarchy of this has been baked into the culture for centuries, and it's something that still impacts us today. Because it's not just about plays, it's not just about stories. The stories we tell really shape the world that we live in. Who we see as plausible impacts not only who plays the lead in a story, but who gets grant money, or who gets hired, or who's allowed a seat at the table. If people find that it strains the imagination to see a woman or a slave as the main character in a fictional story, how are they going to believe that in real life? It's just a leap that they won't be able to make. So I see this underlying thing that's happening, and it's really baked into our culture as one of the sources of the attacks that we're seeing now on diversity and inclusion and equity. It is impossible for people who have always had access to being the main character to really and truly believe in the full possibility of other people inhabiting that kind of role. So that's the origin story of this piece. And now back to the work. I'm calling this piece a sonnet, and I'm using sonnet here as a collective noun for a group of sculptures. So this manifestation of Even a Woman or a Slave is composed of 7 paired sculptures. So there's 14 in total, and each one of those sculptures embodies a literary theme that you would find in a story or in a play through the sculpture. So in a sonnet that's built with words, there's usually a shift that happens somewhere where the poet introduces a nuance or a different point of view. And I'm introducing that shift into each couplet of sculpture so that each pair shows 2 sides of a concept. So this first pair, and we're not going to look at all of them, but this first pair is belonging and isolation. So isolation is small. It's about the size of the palm of your hand, and it sits alone on a plinth. It's a little bit lonely, but it's also content in its solitude. Belonging is a group of three that fit very close together. They're all huddled together and they stand tall and they have the comfort of being close and together, but they also have the smothering nature of that closeness. So for these sculptures, I went for a very restricted color palette. They're all unglazed, single-fired stoneware. And in keeping with the quote, I am using inferior, basically worthless material. The clay is all recycled, and the fir plinths are really cheap, inferior wood, very much inferior wood, because I wanted the focus of the attention for this piece to be on the gesture of the form and the placement of it in the plane rather than on decorative elements or fancy materials. So here's another pair. This is admiration and jealousy. And over here, admiration can kind of visualize a future where they might be like the one that they're admiring. And jealousy is happening in both directions, both to and from that group of three and one. And making these really guided my thinking on how these concepts intersect and overlap, and how easy it is to mistake one for the other, and how both can kind of nourish us or poison us, and how both admiration and jealousy can be justified or unjustified. So I really enjoyed making all of these couplets. I do want to make it clear that I am not reacting to that quote or trying to prove that a person, a woman who is descended of slaves, can make art. I reject the entire premise of that there is some test that I would need to pass or that my work would need to pass because of my identity. Because I know that there is literally nothing I could make and nothing I could do that would prove that. So I'm not going to waste my time on it. This Toni Morrison quote really speaks to me about this topic when she talks about the distraction of letting outside voices dictate what you're allowed to do. It concludes with somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. I don't have time to waste trying to prove anyone wrong. I have work to make. So one final note on this piece. I made this piece for a solo exhibition at the Christopher Brodigan Gallery at the Groton School, which is a boarding school outside of Boston. And I had just finished setting it up. And I was behind this wall, kind of over here, packing up my things. And some students, the doors were closed, and some students were walking by and peered into the doors while they were still closed. So they couldn't see me and I couldn't see them. But one of them says to the other, "Bro, these are just rocks." And I loved that. I absolutely love that. So first of all, for someone like me, that there is no higher compliment in the world. I would love to be able to make just rocks. And then secondly, over the course of the week, I was there for a week and I had a chance to engage with the students at the opening night and really talk to them over the course of the week. We had some great discussions about this piece and about minimalism in general and how it can be deceptive and how creating something simple can actually aid in communicating complexity. And it can be harder than it looks. So I loved that, but I will forever consider Bro, These Are Just Rocks as an alternate title to Even a Woman or a Slave. Okay, we're up to piece four. And this next piece is called 5 feet 4 inches Forward. So for this piece, I'd been doing some reading about Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a voting rights activist in the 60s and 70s. And you would probably recognize one of her more memorable quotes, which is, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." But there's another line that I feel really demonstrates the depth of her commitment to the movement and her very clear-eyed recognition of the world that we live in. She says, "It seems like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom." And I just think there's so much power in that line. There's so much going on that it formed the entire basis of my portrait of her. So this is it. This is the portrait. And clearly it's not a likeness of Fannie Lou Hamer. It is a portrait, and I'm portraying her in a couple of different ways. The first one is just through scale. This piece is 5 feet 4 inches high. It is constructed of 64 individual 1 inch high hollowed out slabs that are stacked with just enough space to let light shine through on the edges. I really wanted to emphasize the scale through that regularity, that inch by inch by inch by inch. A lot of my work is much smaller. The isolation piece that we were just looking at, that's something that will fit in the palm of your hand. But working at this scale really helped me understand some of the fullness of that quote with a lot more clarity. I also wanted to show through this piece the precariousness of her situation. So the slabs are all stabilized with a rod through the middle, and each slab rests on the one below. And the sculpture will move and sway, and it doesn't really look like it should stand. And that lack of support and the treacherousness of Fannie Lou Hamer's footing in the world is what I'm trying to show through that movement. Mrs. Hamer had a fifth grade education, and that's a fifth grade at a school for Black kids in the 1920s in Mississippi. So it was not the best education. Her family was always food and housing insecure, and she just did not have a strong footing to stand on. But what she was able to accomplish, even with that minimal foundation, is incredible. She was a very powerful speaker, very powerful leader, and she had the kind of grit and determination that we celebrate in our entrepreneurs and in our leaders. And when I think about her, I really lament what we as the world missed out on by getting in her way at every single turn. Like, what if we had invested in her? What if she had had the kind of education and exposure and support to really spread her wings? What would we have seen from Fannie Lou Hamer if she had had that support? A couple of other things I want to highlight about this piece. One is the process of making it. Mrs. Hamer was a cotton sharecropper, extremely hard work. Her family did not have the kind of resources that it would have taken to buy tools or technology that would have made the work easier. And I wanted to put some of that into the process to reflect that. So each layer is hand rolled and cut and hollowed, and I used a drywall mudding knife to shape the edges, to cut the edges and leave them crisp and sharp, but also with clay that would drag and create a vertical texture with scrapes and very sharp corners and give it some warping. So I wanted the process to make visible the work of it. And then finally, there's a bit of symbol. So this layer that we're looking at here, it's about a third of the way from the top. And that is fractured. Mrs. Hamer was a survivor of state and medical violence, and I wanted to make that aspect a bit of a focal point in a way that was similar to what she did to bring that violence into the piece. She used her experience as a way to focus people's attention and get them to listen to her and understand the reality of her message and really take her seriously. So this is my first portrait. I really enjoyed making it, of abstracting this quote and her life as a way of understanding her and her situation. And it has really helped me see also parallels with what's going on today in our world and also at times of resistance in the past. The directness of her facing the known threat head on reminded me of the words of Sophie Scholl, who was one of the activists of the White Rose Resistance Group in the 1940s in Germany. At some point before she was executed, she said to a friend, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there's hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause?" And Fannie Lou Hamer, with her 5 feet and her 4 inches, was willing to give herself up. And I really wanted this portrait to honor that. Okay, this next pot explores the idea of a pot as a social agent or something with a role to play in our lives. So Compose is an interactive sculpture that is comprised of a hardwood plank with grooves carved into it, and one or more wafer-thin, irregularly shaped translucent porcelain discs that are decorated with a line of red iron oxide. So the discs can be placed into the grooves and rotated and moved closer together or moved farther apart, and they can create a composition with light and proximity and shadow. And here's another image of them. Some of them warp a little bit, and some have a line that maybe continues to the other side, so they can be flipped over or laid down or turned. And what it's meant to do is to hold on to things that might be too big to hold in your mind or in your body, or things that are too big for language. So I'm going to steal and willfully misinterpret a bit of Wittgenstein here. That is Proposition 7, that things that we cannot talk about must be given over to silence. And this sculpture gives the viewer a nonverbal vocabulary for giving something over to silence. In the act of creating a composition, they can put whatever they need to put into the work. So if they've just fallen in love and they can't contain their happiness, or they have a worry that they can't get out of their heads and can't let go of, or a thing or an event that they want to remember, this piece gives them a way to kind of store that in the clay. I'm really interested in how these sculptures will be used in someone's life. It's part of a series. I've made 6 of these so far, and at different scales, some very small, some larger. And I'm interested in how people will interact with them over time and become a part of the environment. So I could imagine, for example, if a family had someone going off to college for the first time, the family could create a collective composition together, and they might leave it that way until graduation. Or if a person is starting a new job and they've got both excitement and worry about that, they could put that into the sculpture and alter it as they get more comfortable in their role. So part of the design of this that's integral to this pot is the delicacy of it. As you can see here, these are really thin pieces, and I'm using that delicacy to focus your attention. The records are so thin, these discs are so thin that they will break if you're not being careful and paying attention. So the compositions that you make have a constraint in their execution built into the work. You have to do just this. You have to do this when you have time to give that composition your full attention so that it will hold. So that's composition. The next pot that we're going to look at is called General Order. And this is a piece that was designed to celebrate Juneteenth. I started this in 2022, the first year that we had Juneteenth as a national holiday, and I just really wanted to participate in the joy of that. So I assigned myself a 10-year project where each year I would make a short run series, so 22 in 2022, 23 in 2023, and distribute them hopefully all over the world so that wherever there's one of those pieces, the work will exist in its entirety. That first year, I made celebration cups, which were these white porcelain cups. They were unglazed on the exterior, and they had a pearlescent white glaze on the inside. And then I used a dotting technique to dot 6/19/22 as a way of marking the date for these pieces. Then for 2023, I did a sharing bowl, which was a larger format bowl that had a number of different connections to an abstracted oyster shell. So one of the touchstones for that was a connection to Galveston, Texas. Juneteenth, Galveston, Texas is where Juneteenth kind of originated from. And it's celebrated there, or it's celebrated because that's where the enforcement of slavery being over came to Galveston, Texas much later on June 19th than it was celebrated anywhere else. So Galveston had been a major oyster town. And in the mid to late 1800s, they had used the shells of discarded oysters to make roads. So they had these oyster shell roads, and I wanted to bring that connection into this piece. And the other inspiration for this came from a mental image that has stuck with me for a very long time. So years ago, I remember reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. It's probably in middle school or high school. And there is a portion where he is describing how food and security was used as a weapon against the people. And one of the things that they would do was literally pour food for children onto the ground and let children kind of grab what they could as fast as they could. And some of the children would have these oyster shells that they would use to scoop up the food and get it faster than the other children so they could get more food and have more to eat. And I have long remembered the heartbreak of that. And so I wanted to bring some of that history into this shape. It also has a bit of red iron oxide, and then the 6/19/23 this year marked down the side. This piece. 2 years ago, I did these call and response platters, and there were two for every one, so it was a set. So I made 48 of these platters, one large and one small. And when somebody bought one, I sent one to them and one to someone else that they were physically separated from, but that they held in their heart. And what I'm calling attention to here is a little bit of history around Juneteenth that happened at the end of the Civil War. there were people all over the country whose families had been pulled apart by slavery, and they were trying to find each other. And they would write these classified ads in Black-owned and Quaker-owned newspapers saying things like, I'm looking for my mom. I haven't seen her in 16 years. Here's where I last saw her. I'm looking for my sister. I'm looking for my family, my siblings, my child, someone who was taken away by the violence of slavery, and they were trying to find them. So they're putting out these desperate but beautiful calls into the world and just hoping for a response, hoping that someone will see it, will recognize who those two people are and mention it and say, hey, your mom's looking for you. Your family's looking for you. They haven't forgotten you. And they would try and get back together again. So I wanted to create these platters to kind of honor that feeling of hope against hope in 2024. So I did not make one last year, had a lot going on with the move and so much going on. So I'm a year behind. But you know what? I assigned myself this project, so I'm going to give myself a little bit of grace and stretch it out again. I am going to try and do it this year, but eventually I think it will be. It may take me longer than 11 years, but I will get to 10 of these general order pieces over the course of my career. And the name general order comes from this general order comes from, it was U.S. Army's General Order Number 3, and that was the order that was given in Galveston, Texas to enforce the end of slavery. Okay, we are at our last pot, and it's a quick one, so we hopefully won't go too much over the allotted time. And now you see why I had to cut at least one, probably should have cut two. This piece is called Sour, Hot, Bitter, and Sweet, and it is a ceremonial piece that is designed for use in a wedding. It is for a ritual called the tasting of the elements that is practiced in many world cultures, but particularly in Black American culture and West African culture, where the participants taste something that is sour, like lemon, and something hot, like pepper, vinegar, and honey, these four flavors. And then they reflect on the different seasons that their life is going to have, that they know it's not always going to be sweet, but it's not always going to be bitter. And it gives them a way to think about how the blend of these things is going to make for a full and rich and flavorful life experience. So on its own, it's a very simple design, four hand-formed porcelain dishes that sit on a plank of cedar. But I'm using them here to create something that's more than the sum of its parts and the story around it and the celebration of Black joy. So I think the porcelain does this really well. There's just a clarity with the color and the shape. And it's also something that I want the couple to continue using throughout their life. Yes, these are ritual pieces, but you could use these dishes for ketchup or for soy sauce or salt, and it could become part of your daily life and act as a reminder of that celebration and a continual way to celebrate that joy. This is, again, a serial work. So the first one, this one that we're seeing right here, was for an exhibition at the Northern Clay Center. And then I made another one that had a slight variation. I made one with a walnut plinth instead of cedar. And instead of a white glaze on the interior, I used a copper blue glaze. And I used copper because copper is a traditional 7th anniversary wedding gift. And I wanted to do something that would not only honor the beginning of a journey, but also milestones along the way and recognize that joy happens over time and it's not just at the start. So I will likely make one of these with a tin white glaze for a 10th anniversary, or maybe a little bit of gold luster, a tiny, tiny bit of gold luster for a 50th anniversary, because I really like the idea of celebrating the whole journey, not just the beginning. So this is sour, hot, bitter, and sweet. And now we have come to the end of the numbered pots, and I want to talk very briefly about what's next and where I'm going and what I'm hoping to do in the future with some of this work. So what's next is the really big adventure. My husband and I have moved to a very small town in California, Los Alamos, and we've opened an architecture studio and pottery studio and retail space. And it is really an experiment in being able to make both sculptural work and functional work and have a place to display and sell that work directly. It is really early days still. Yes, it's a year and a half in, but we are learning a lot, and it's still very much in that startup entrepreneurial space where we're trying things out, and some things are working and some things aren't, and we're moving forward. And what's really challenging is trying to match the rhythm of making pottery with the rhythm of a retail store, which those are very different timelines. And so that's something we're learning. And what I love about this is that I have the ability to make and sell my work and present my work and get feedback about it any weekend that we're open and very directly and regularly. And I also have a venue for any larger work that might make. So I wouldn't necessarily need to have a space or a gallery or a show that was going to be in. If I had an idea for a sculpture, I could exhibit it in my studio slash gallery slash stop shop and have a place for it. So that's the next big adventure. And I hope that these seven pots help you see that what I'm all about, what I'm trying to do. The through line for the work is that I'm really trying to highlight something invisible and exploit clay's ability to make the intangible tactile. The more and the more that I engage with this material, the more I see new pathways for building meaning and developing new vocabularies and inviting people into a shared experience through the work. So, thank you so much for your attention. If anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer them.